Active Directory: Alternative Authentication Schemes by Joe Squillace. Presentation Overview. During this presentation, we'll cover the following topics. What is Active Directory and what is authentication? How does authentication work? Active Directory authentication versus Active Directory authorization. The different Active Directory authentication means and methods available. Things to consider when choosing an alternative Active Directory authentication system. The alternative Active Directory authentication methods available today. We'll look at the pros and cons of each of the alternative Active Directory authentication systems. We'll look at the most widely used alternative Active Directory authentication system in use today. A recommendation for alternative Active Directory authentication system, and we'll look at several companies that do offer alternative Active Directory authentication solutions to your system. What is Active Directory and what is authentication? Active Directory is a directory service that's included with most Microsoft Windows Server operating systems, and it serves as a central location for network security, network administration, and management control of resources for administrators and management personnel. Through the security function, Active Directory is responsible for authenticating and authorizing all users and computers that will be accessing protected resources within or on the network. Authentication is the process of verifying that the user actually is who they say or claim to be, and Active Directory is responsible for this task. Active Directory uses Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or LDAP, versions 2 and 3, and Kerberos, using Primary Key Infrastructure, or PKI, as its primary authentication models. So, how does authentication work? When a user or system attempts to gain access to a network, they're required to input some form of credentials that contain some combination of a username and a password. Once the user has input these credentials, the system then compares the credentials that were input to a master list containing acceptable username-password combinations. If there is an initial match with the username and password, then the user or system is granted initial access to the network. However, the user is momentarily limited in what resources they can access until an authorization check has been performed. This authorization check will then validate which network resources that specific user, based on matching the username password entered, can access based on granted or assigned permissions given to them by the administration. Active Directory authentication versus authorization. Active Directory authentication is the process of determining whether or not someone or something is who or what they are claiming to be. Authentication usually involves some combination of a username and a password that needs to be verified before being granted access to a computer or a network. Active Directory authorization, on the other hand, is the process of determining which permissions a user or system has been granted and what resources they are permitted to access based on those permissions. Once a user or system has been authenticated and granted initial access to the system, they will then be evaluated on an authorization level to determine exactly which resources they are entitled to reference, use, and be permitted to access to, and to what level of access they should receive based on those permissions. Active Directory authentication means and method. Means of authentication is grouped into three categories. 1. Something a user knows. This is usually a username and a password. 2. Something a user has. This is usually a key card or a smart card or a USB token. And 3. Something a user is. This is a physical characteristic of that user, some type of biometrics. Multi-factor authentication. This is the act of authenticating a user based on a combination of more than one authentication method. There's Kerberos, which is a ticket-based system using some sort of shared secret key or tokens. And there's CHAP, which is Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, which is a three-way handshake authentication system that is used with dial-up connections. Now, there are several other alternative authentication methods that can be used instead or in combination with Active Directory. Now, some things to consider when choosing an alternative Active Directory authentication system. What operating systems will be used with the alternative solution? Will they be using Windows, Linux, Mac, etc.? What is the cost of implementing the alternative solution into your network or system currently? What's the initial cost of the devices, the license fees, the training cost, the software, etc.? What is the cost of replacing different components of the alternative solution? In other words, replacement devices, batteries, authentication codes, damage, theft, etc. Is there a variety of options and methods available to implement a multi-factor or two-factor authentication system across your system platform? And what type of support will your company need with the new system once it's implemented? Will the system require coordination with product agents or clients or additional follow-up training? These are questions that need to be asked before you implement and decide on authentication system. Alternative Active Directory authentication methods available. Biometric Let's look at some of the pros and cons of the different alternative authentication systems. Biometrics. With facial recognition, some of the pros are they can be matched quickly, and the facial features do not change over the course of a lifetime. However, there's only a 90% success rate, which means that there is a 10% failure rate. These can also be tricked by other images, and facial recognition seems to favor men more than women. With hand geometry, pros are they are simple and easy to use, they're unobtrusive to the user, and they're relatively inexpensive. With smart cards, some of the pros are these are very convenient devices to the end user, they're self-contained security, they're inexpensive, and they're portable. However, smart cards are easily lost or stolen. They have limited encryption options based on their small chip size, and you need special equipment to read the smart cards themselves. With USB devices, these are more secure than traditional username and password combinations. They can hold encryption keys and certificates on each individual device, and they're relatively inexpensive and portable devices. However, the user must also carry and possess the USB device at all times. These are also easily lost or stolen, and you need multiple keys or certificates for multiple tasks or functions. And just an FYI, because of the ease of how it can be deployed as a technology and the non-obtrusive manner in which the data can be collected and compared, facial recognition is currently being used by police, military, and Homeland Security to locate criminals and threats today, both locally and internationally, through work with UN and NATO. Alternative Active Directory authentication systems that are most widely being used today. Because data is much too valuable to not keep secure, and tough passwords are simply too much trouble for end users to remember and maintain, most companies, once they base the comparisons of the pros and cons for all of the available alternative authentication options that are available, they choose to go with a two-factor authentication system that uses a combination of a password plus a 4 to 6 digit PIN number and a USB device with a random code that's new every minute for logon purposes. The user password is generated based on the recommended Microsoft password policy criteria, and the PIN number is a random number that is unique and memorized by the user, usually 4 to 6 digits in length. The USB device is to be carried by the user and then inserted into the workstation as part of the authentication process when the user signs on. Plus, the company is protected if the USB is ever lost or stolen because it cannot be used to access the system since the personal PIN is required with the device to be granted access to the system or resource. Based on what I've read and researched, my personal recommendation for an alternative authentication method to be used with Active Directory is a system that is based on what you need from the alternative system to do and how to achieve your security goals with it. However, it would be best to implement a system that is easy to integrate with your current system and software, is easy for users to use and implement into their daily routine, is cost effective to install, maintain, and train personnel to use, works across and with a multitude of operating system and software already in place, works with mobile devices and mobile applications that users currently use, allows two-factor authentication and multiple configuration options, uses a minimal amount of system resources once installed and is being used, and is secure in itself and secure with the data that it collects from users. Based on what I've found and what I've researched, I would recommend Gold Key Security and implement a two-factor authentication system using the USB with random PIN and a unique password. They offer the most options for the largest amount of people and resources and cost the other companies that offer solutions for smart cards and USB devices: Gold Key Technology, Cypress Security, CryptoCard Securities, and CyberSafe with Trust Broker software. Some references that were used: and more references that were used today. Thanks for viewing.